What do you do on staycation? Well, if you're me, you build a patio. And why not? When we moved in, we found a number of old patio stones at the far end of the property, and we needed a sitting area. Now there's a catch. Behind the house, it's a bit wonky, so we would need to build a frame rather than dig directly into the ground. But Glenn and I, we were confident. We'd put in a sidewalk at our house in Edmonton, and I'd watch YouTube videos, and I'd talk to Dan for advice before my holiday. What could possibly go wrong? A lot. Everything went great at first, but as we went along, it became clear the stones weren't going to fit. And in a moment of panic, I called Dan to see if he had a wet saw. The only solution I saw was cutting those stones. Luckily, the next morning, I could see our predicament with brand new eyes. It was the frame that needed to change, not the stones. And with Dan's help, a few days later, we finally had a patio. Now, I offer this not just because I wanted to share what I've been up to over the last 3 weeks, but because it's instructive on how I can get locked into one way of thinking. And just as I was convinced we did everything right in terms of the frame, the same is true of words, especially churchy words. We get used to hearing them in one way, in a certain way. And we either hold on to that meaning of the word we know in our head, or we end up tossing those words aside. But what if instead we reframed them, looked at them with fresh understanding? And over the next few Sundays, it's my intention to do just that. And the first word I like to look at, today's word, is Lord. In the gospel, Peter twice calls Jesus Lord. But we don't say Lord very much in the United Church, and for some good reasons. Now, it makes sense to use some male images for Jesus, but we try not to use gender-exclusive language regarding God. The practice of saying Lord, which is English for Adonai, comes from Judaism, where Adonai is used wherever the letters of God's name are written. And this wasn't lost on Matthew, who on one level was connecting God and Jesus together. In Psalm 29, God sits enthroned over the sea, and in the gospel, Jesus walks on water. Matthew is pointing to God's relationship with Jesus, emphasizing how God is present in and through him. And with Peter joining Jesus on the water, he's also suggesting that God works in and through us as well. But over time, I think we've lost sense of that. And in fact, even gone the other way. And in many ways, I feel we started overreaching theologically because, well, I hear a lot more people praying to rather than through Jesus, which is the tradition. One concern about this is that it shifts our focus to heaven. Worship becomes our purpose rather than living out in the world what Jesus taught us. And the evolution makes some sense. You call God Lord, you call Jesus Lord, then you call Jesus God, and the next thing you know, Jesus is the one who you're praying to. But we end up losing the nuance of Trinity, the genius of God as divine community, calling us into community as well. Now, that's not why we dropped Lord in the United Church, But if doing so helps us avoid conflating Jesus and God and helps us avoid losing Trinitarian theology, well, I'm okay with that. And yet, I'm not okay when I consider another reason we call Jesus Lord. One more focused on earth than on heaven. You see, the words Adon, Kyrios, Dominus were directed to people and not just to a deity. If you watch Downton Abbey, you'll recall that the parents were known as Lord and Lady Grantham. In the UK, they have a House of Lords, not a Senate. The term Lord is part of a hierarchy extending back through the Middle Ages and beyond. And it was synonymous with Roman society. Anyone higher in status than you was Dominus or Domina. Now, I'm not suggesting that any of this is good. Social, political, and economic injustices were built into the system, especially in the practice of slavery. And as much as we'd like to think that's all behind us, in our hearts we know that it isn't. We hear this in Miami Airport by Raymond Antrobus. The poem, as you heard, is a series of questions asked of him at customs. And when you realize that he's not going to go free, even though he doesn't have any drugs, it becomes clear that the final question, what did you not hear, is not just part of that one moment, but a broader, don't you understand how the system works? That as a black man, you'll always be considered guilty and needing to be kept under heel. This way of seeing the world is how Greco-Roman civilization worked. And its ruler, Caesar, was Lord. But Jesus came to help us reframe how the world works. And so to assert Jesus is Lord is to say that Caesar is not. That the way of Jesus, his teaching of compassion and inclusion and love and sharing with one another, which we heard about last week, all of that is how God's reign works. And like the disciples told to tend to the needs of the people, we too respond to their needs by living this out, seeking a just and equitable society where no one is presumed guilty because of the color of their skin, where no one can assert that one race, gender, culture, orientation, ability, body type, religion is the norm. And to get there, we need to reframe how we see our world, how we see ourselves in it, and how we see others in it as well. I saw a meme recently which captures it beautifully. Lisa Simpson is on a stage, and it looks like she's speaking primarily to, well, they're yellow men. Those are white men in Simpsons. Over it reads, Black lives isn't anti-white. Feminism isn't anti-men. Gay pride isn't anti-straight. It isn't about you. For me, that captures how we get past the status quo of prejudice and privilege and power. And saying Jesus is Lord is how we proclaim our fealty to that new vision. Now, though we proclaim fealty to that, the world, I know for me, seems set. People forcing others to fit into the frame. How else does the meaning of Jesus is Lord get so easily lost? Racism continuing long after the official abolition of slavery. Women still struggling for equality. The environment continually threatened. people in Beirut asserting that it was government corruption that caused the explosion. Commentators sharing their fear that the U.S. president is not going to leave the White House no matter what November brings. But despite all that, I have hope, and this is why. Because when Jesus questioned Peter about his doubt, he was really saying that Peter was caught between two ways of seeing the world, which means that Peter could see a different way of seeing the world, and so can we. That's why people keep struggling for equality. It's why we keep tackling climate change. It's why people take to the streets of Portland and Toronto and Beirut. It's why they raise the alarm of political overreach. It's because they haven't given up hope. And that's what we do. That's what it means when we affirm that Jesus is Lord. And that same Jesus comes to the disciples in the last watch, when it is darkest and they are farthest from shore. He comes to remind them and us that it is darkest right before the dawn. Now, friends, ironically in all this, if my affirming Jesus is Lord means all that I just said, I can't keep using Jesus is Lord, because the word Lord is still gender exclusive. It still denotes master to a slave. It still affirms hierarchy, all the things that Jesus came to challenge. Perhaps I can't use a word with that much baggage, but we still see the word in traditional prayers, and we still sing the word in hymns. And so when I read it or I sing it, I know what I'll be doing. I will be affirming the vision of Jesus and committing myself to live out the justice, compassion, and love that God desires for us. Perhaps you'll be doing the same. Amen.